Over the past month, Canadian politics has turned into a real-life episode of The Twilight Zone. Or maybe The West Wing. Let's break down the whirlwind of events that have kept the country on the edge of its seat. It all started on December 17, 2024, when Chrystia Freeland resigned as finance minister over economic clashes with the Prime Minister on the same morning as the fall economic statement. Days later, President-elect Trump threatened to make Canada the 51st state. Then came the bombshell. Prime Minister Trudeau announced his resignation. And just as the dust settled, Mark Carney teased a Liberal leadership bid on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Meanwhile, Freeland launched her own leadership campaign, perfectly timed before Trump's second inauguration. It's been a wild ride in Canadian politics. Joining us today is Eugene Lang, a powerhouse in Canadian policy with insights that bridge government, business, and academia. As an assistant professor at Queen's University School of Policy Studies, Eugene brings decades of experience in shaping public policy and strategic communication. He served in senior roles within the public service, as chief of staff to federal cabinet ministers, and as a trusted consultant to multinational companies on advocacy and policy development. Oh, and did I mention he's the go-to expert on Canadian politics and a national best-selling author? Let's talk politics with Eugene Lang. Over the course of a month, we've seen so much happen politically in Canada. I don't know if we've ever seen something turn as fast in Canadian living history. And it, to me, feels like really like we're kind of diving into this dystopic political drama kind of unfolding in real time. So have you seen anything like this in your career? And with all these events going on, what do you think this signals for the future of Canada's political direction?
I have not seen anything like this. I've been through some crises in government. For example, when 9/11 happened, that was a pretty big shock to the system. But I've never seen anything quite like this. The combination of the shock coming from the United States, which to my mind is real and is a major, major threat and crisis, at the same time as basically the federal government's dissolving before our eyes. And there's chaos in the federal government, in my opinion, both in the public service side and in the political side of the government. The finance minister resigns abruptly with no warning. The day that she's scheduled to deliver the fall economic statement, which has basically been delayed by a month, I'm not sure anything like that has ever happened before.
Yeah, it was definitely a shock. And both you and I have experience in Liberal governments, about 2 decades between our different experiences. In your view, when did things go south for the Liberals, and maybe even more specifically, Justin Trudeau as the leader?
What I've observed, they were doing quite well in the public opinion surveys all through the pandemic. In fact, if you look at public opinion surveys during the pandemic, for the first time in probably 2 or 3 decades, overall confidence in government and legitimacy measures around government was at a pretty all-time high. I think people felt that governments were doing a good job, and the Trudeau government was getting the benefit of that in the public opinion surveys. I think a post-pandemic malaise, and in particular the inflation that kicked in. Inflation historically can destroy governments. It corrodes public support in governments. Governments get blamed for inflation even if it isn't their fault. There's an expectation that governments deal with it. I'm old enough to remember when inflation was the issue for many, many years in Canada. But unless you're my age, you don't remember inflation. You don't remember the corrosive effect it can have on the public, on the economy, and on governments. I do. Inflation started to destroy the Trudeau government. It's not the only factor, but it's one of the factors. Both their rhetorical response to it and their substantive response to it wasn't good enough. Although substantively, I'm not sure there's much they could have done about it. The opposition politicians, particularly the Conservatives, capitalized on that. And I think you can trace decline in public support from the Liberals from about that point coming out of the pandemic when the inflation hit. On top of that, you have just the natural fatigue people have with a government that's been in power 9 years. Usually, again, in my life experience, a government gets about 9 years, and that's about it. The Mulroney government got 9 years, 2 terms. The Chrétien government got 10 years, a little bit longer with the Martin extension to it. The Harper government got 9 years. And then the other thing that I would add to it is Mr. Trudeau personally I think people got very fatigued with his style. He was in the face of the public in a way that prime ministers typically are not. And I think that worked for him while he was popular. His brand and his image worked until it didn't. And then it was the opposite. It was a negative. People got sick of hearing from him, sick of seeing him, sick of his discourse, his style. You put all those three things together and it just drove the government right into the ditch.
Yeah, absolutely. And a few things I want to kind of pick out of that. The magnitude, I've personally never seen it younger, but, the amount of F Trudeau flags and like the merchandise around feeding a leader of the country, which everyone's entitled to their free speech, but it was so anger fueled, which was, I think, really scary working in the government, going through an election as well, through the pandemic, knocking on doors. You really felt that resentment from the public on different areas of whether it's scandals that came out of that government, the deficits they were running. It was just really interesting to see those kind of dynamics. You made a point there, well, we haven't seen a prime minister that much in maybe people's faces. Would you say that's because of social media and the way we receive news these days? Because we're definitely seeing, I would say, from my perspective, scrolling on Instagram, I'm seeing a lot more right-wing ideas coming up on social media. So I'm just curious from your career, seeing how politicians engage with the public and this element of social media. How does that change the dynamic, do you think?
So first off, I'd say I know very little about social media. I'm not on it, apart from LinkedIn. But I will say Mr. Trudeau's government federally is the first social media government we've had, really. I mean, we had social media in the Harper government, but it wasn't utilized the way it was under Trudeau, and it wasn't dominating the culture the way it was under Trudeau even 10 years ago. So he's the first social media prime minister, and he fully embraced it from what I understand. And when you embrace a technology like that, you got to take the good with the bad. And if you're doing well and you're popular, it's going to go well for you. And if it starts going the other way, it's an accelerant, an intensifier of the negative. I will say he's not the first prime minister, even in my lifetime, to be given the F word by people. I remember his father. At the end, people forget how deeply unpopular Pierre Trudeau was in the early 1980s. Now, he'd been in office for 16 years, almost consecutively, with one brief interregnum when Joe Clark was prime minister for 9 months. But there was a lot of F.U. Pierre Trudeau going on, particularly in Western Canada at that time, through the 70s and into the early 80s. Similarly with Mr. Mulroney, he was actually lower in the polls than Trudeau is now. He was around 9 to 12% in the polls at the end of 1992. It wasn't the age of social media, but the idea that prime ministers can become deeply resented and even hated, to me, it's not new. The intensity around Trudeau might be higher because of the accelerant and the intensity of social media, but it's not entirely new. The other thing I would say is Trudeau, I think partly it's his persona, his whole kind of the theory of the Trudeau prime ministership seemed to be all about him. The celebrity nature of Mr. Trudeau, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. He came into office as a celebrity. He leveraged that celebrity in terms of his looks, his name, his family history, all of this stuff. And you live and die by the sword. As in the good times it works, and in the bad times it doesn't.
No, I think very well said. And being so forefront, it was really interesting to see him step down because of how centralized I think the Liberal brand was so synonymous with Trudeau. As someone working in it, it was like always trying to incorporate him in our materials. And I think it really was counterintuitive. Like, to your point, it wasn't 2015. We weren't riding on this fresh, new, bushy, bright-eyed Trudeau. There was a lot of stuff that came in between. So I think that leads a bit into my question of why do you think it took him so long to step down? Do you think that maybe it was his ego? Do you think it was some bad advice from whether it be the party or his close net of folks advising him? Because the Liberal brand seems to be struggling. We can point to them losing 2 key by-elections in ridings previously held by ministers, one in Toronto St. Paul and the other in Quebec's La Salle. Provincially, we see similar challenges. In BC, the Liberals are nearly non-existent. And in New Brunswick, Susan Holt led her party to a majority by deliberately distancing herself from the federal Liberals, barely mentioning them in their campaign. So, given this context, what are your thoughts on Trudeau stepping down as leader and why it took him so long?
Well, first thing I'd say is most leaders who are prime minister don't go willingly or easily, and most overstay their welcome. That's the history. His father overstayed his welcome, arguably, and others throughout history. On the other hand, the evidence that started to mount, as I said earlier, after the pandemic, it was pretty clear that he was not electable again, and particularly following the by-election loss in St. Paul's in June. By the way, it's the first time a party with Conservative in its name had won an election in the 416 since 1988. So that should be a body blow to the psychology of the federal Liberal Party, and I think it was that to the caucus, because it was really after that that the caucus pressure started to mount on him. They recognized, if we can lose St. Paul's, where is the bottom? Every riding is at risk. Following that, he loses 3 months later in LaSalle-Verdun. That riding had kind of swung back and forth a little bit, but former Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin held that seat for 20 consecutive years, and that seat was lost. Those two things, coupled with 18 months of opinion polls that showed a 15 to 20 point gap, plus the fact it's a 3-term government that's been in office for 9 years, plus the fact that his own popularity ratings were in the ditch, should have been enough if someone is self-aware and has some sense of history to convince him to resign in the fall. It wasn't. I don't know why. You said ego. Well, definitely ego has played a role here. The evidence was clear. And then his caucus, the mounting pressure from his caucus, and he still hung in, and the Freeland debacle, and he still hung in for another 2 or 3 weeks. By the way, that 2 or 3 weeks is a consequential 2 or 3 weeks that set up the country very badly. Even if he had left on the 18th of December, it would be a different conversation today. 3 weeks can be a lifetime in politics. So I guess he was getting bad advice, or maybe he was getting no advice. There tends to be a bubble that goes, as they say, that gets around these people where they're going to have a kind of a distorted view of reality. They only hear what they want to hear. Maybe that played out, but the evidence was all there. The time was up. He should have left probably in the summer after the St. Paul's defeat. If they had a sense of history, they would know that riding's been rock solid Liberal for 35 years, and if you're losing that, your time is up.
Trudeau, in his resignation speech, pointed specifically, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, but he basically said, I couldn't go forward because of internal battles that I was dealing with.
I want to make a comment on that. It's the Prime Minister's job, number one job and responsibility, to maintain caucus support behind him and his government. You should not take that for granted. He took it for granted. By contrast, as I mentioned earlier, in the winter of 1993, Mr. Mulroney's government was down around, at one point, I think, 9% in the polls. Think about that. A majority government at 9% in the polls. Trudeau has not gone that low. From my understanding of that history, his caucus did not want him to leave. They were prepared for him to take them into the election in the fall of 1993. They were fiercely loyal to him, his caucus, and his cabinet to the end. He managed to maintain that unity because he worked on it. I don't think Mr. Trudeau's done that over the years. I think he's taken caucus support for granted, and that works when you are doing well in the polls, but when you're doing poorly in the polls, it doesn't work. That's why you had the disunity. That's why you had what he calls the battles.
You and I have had previous conversations how ministers before the Trudeau government owned their files. They were the ministers, they were the experts of that file. In the Trudeau government, it was a completely different reality. It was PMO had to have their hand in every file, giving direction on how your file should be run. Do you think this is a good way to run government, or do you think this is what led to these internal battles and these conflicts between ministers and caucus?
It's a terrible way to run a government. I don't know that it led to the internal conflicts, but I do think it led to eventually the unpopularity of the government because, again, you're personifying everything in the leader, and that's what the Trudeau government has done over the years. And I don't think it leads to good execution of policy. What we saw with the Trudeau government, one of the biggest criticisms of it from observers and other experts is it's the kind of government that announced a lot of things and really failed on execution and implementation. And I would say a lot of that comes down to the fact that the ministers weren't really empowered the way they should have been and have been in previous governments. You can't execute and implement portfolio files from the Prime Minister's office. It simply doesn't work. So that model of government is bad model of government, in my view. And it's not just my view, it's the view of a lot of people that actually know things about government. We need to get away from it. We need to get back to cabinet government where ministers, first of all, they understand what their legal and programmatic authorities, and they're empowered to execute them. In the governments that I worked in, that was the case by and large, certainly for the ministers I worked for. Can we get back to that? Will we get back to that? I'm not confident, but I think that's what we need to get back to. Real cabinet government. By the way, Mr. Trudeau promised that in 2015. He promised that we did not get back to cabinet government. We got back to government by prime ministerial fiat. You know it better than me. You saw it up close and personal.
I felt like there was this weird micromanagement from the top, which was really frustrating on us trying to do our jobs. But do you think and we'll get into the new candidates for the Liberal leadership, do you think any of them might bring back some of those older school tactics or those, more seasoned professionals back into government? I find it hard to believe when you have Freeland, who's worked so closely and so tight with the Trudeau government and the brand, as well as Minister Karina Gould. But I'm a bit hopeful with Carney. So I'm just curious on if you think that's kind of a dead possibility or there might be a resurgence.
I tend to agree with you. I think part of the problem is most of the ministers in the Trudeau government know no other way. They came into government the first time under Trudeau. I would say the bigger problem is the bureaucracy has been attuned to this style in a way that's dangerous. I'm not sure the bureaucracy really even understands a different model because most of the senior bureaucrats have only known this model. So I'm doubtful that his successor, whoever it is, especially if it's somebody that's been in the cabinet of this government, will operate in a different way. Carney is a complete outsider in that sense, which I think is a good thing in a way because he's not necessarily infused with that model.
It's really interesting to see how it's going to play out and if he even wins the leadership bid. Freeland and Gould are already well known to the public from their roles as ministers, but here's what I can't really wrap my head around is how can they tell voters they're going to bring about change while being so tied to the current government? And the obvious reaction as to any voter would be, you've been in power for 9 years. Why didn't you change it then? How can they overcome the challenges of their resumes being so closely linked to the Trudeau government? Then we have Carney. He calls himself an outsider. He made reference to that on The Daily Show, but he's also a bit of an insider. He's been an advisor for the Trudeau government. He's always had those kind of close ties. I really think we need that prudent fiscal responsibility that the Liberals have always talked about, but actually never executed or implemented, as you have mentioned. So I'm a bit hopeful for Carney, but it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out and how the campaigns are run.
The interesting point to me is going to be, right, I haven't heard anybody talk about this, but I think it's real. If they start attacking one another, and I think they're going to have to, if they both want it, it could get ugly in the remaining 8 weeks. But they're going to have to fight one another for it. And Carney is already at his launch took shots at the government's economic record, which is a direct shot at her. And I'm sure she sees that as a direct shot at her. If it looks like this is going to be a real fight for votes and it's going to be competitive, I imagine it's going to get a little bit ugly. It could be bad for both of them in terms of whoever wins, then going right into a general election where you've been marked up by a senior member of your own party. And there won't be the usual gap between a convention and the ability to heal those wounds. So that's something to watch for, in my view, to see how aggressive they get towards one another. Maybe they'll be completely civil and it won't be like that. But I have a feeling if it looks competitive, the elbows are going to get up. Again, as Bob Ray famously said, at least to me, politics is a contact sport. And, the elbows get up. And you might even get into a position where the gloves drop and the helmets come off. And we'll see whether that's how it plays out over the next 7-8 weeks.
Very Canadian analogy. I love it.
I'm a hockey fan.
No, it's great. A few points that I wanted to pick up from there is you wrote an article titled, "Is the Business Liberal Extinct?" And we've also heard from Jean Chrétien make comment about how the Liberal Party has to return to this radical center. So a few things I want to unpack there, because Carney, one piece in his leadership announcement I thought was really interesting. And he said, quote, "We can't achieve our potential with the ideas of the far left. They often see the government as the solution for every problem. We can't redistribute what we don't have," end quote. And it goes back to your point, Eugene, about how Carney was kind of taking some shots at the current government and their economic policies. So my question here is, if Carney becomes leader, do you think we're going to see a comeback of the blue Liberal? Or do you believe that the Liberal base has just shifted way too far to the left? And I would more specifically point to the supply and confidence agreement with the NDP.
It's funny that he said that you can't distribute what you don't have. I said that 3 weeks ago on an interview I did on BNN. Maybe he watched that. Will the business Liberal come back? Well, if Carney wins, it sounds like he wants to go in that direction. He has an impressive background in the private sector, which, of course, Mr. Trudeau doesn't have, and really none of his ministers have or ever have had, with the possible exception of Bill Morneau. So my assumption is he will carry that experience into office, and he will try to get the government more focused on economic matters, fiscal matters, growth, productivity, these sorts of things. And that's the kind of agenda that tends to be more in line with what business cares about. Who he puts in his cabinet, though, again, if the cabinet is an empowered cabinet, really matters. Is he going to go out and try to get people to run for him that have that private sector experience, or at least that private sector impulse? It shouldn't be a one-man show. You got to have other people on the team. It's a hockey team. If he does that, I think it can be revived, and I think it should be revived. I think the party has gone way too far to the left in the last 9 years. I think I said recently that the Liberal Party needs a right wing. Otherwise, the left wing has a real tendency to dominate, and you're losing altitude all the time. And I think that's kind of what Mr. Chrétien was saying when he talked about the radical center. So I'm hoping that we get that balance back with Carney.
Absolutely. And again, I was genuinely thrilled when Carney finally threw his hat in the ring for a Liberal leader, because I think the Liberals desperately need a fresh start and a fresh face. Because after leaving government, I found myself really torn on how to vote. I had lost confidence in the Trudeau government, and Poilievre hasn't won me over either. I think, they're both career politicians with little real world experience, and I just don't trust either of them with my vote. But Carney brings this whole new perspective and dimension, I think, to the table. And I'm really excited to see how this is all going to unfold in the coming months. Thank you for listening to part 1 of The Fall of Trudeau's Liberals, right here on Let's Talk Politics. Be sure to tune in next week for part 2, where Eugene and I will explore how the Conservatives are capitalizing on Liberal chaos, how prorogation works, and what this means for the government. It's a conversation you won't want to miss. I'm your host, Julia Pinella. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week on Let's Talk Politics.